Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the American National Cattlewomen podcast, Calling All Cattlewomen. I am today's host, Nikki Nimlos, and we're hosting today's episode in Fort Collins, Colorado, at the Soils Lab at Colorado State University. And today I'm joined by Dr. Paige Stanley, who is a research scientist at Colorado State and a research fellow with the Noble Research Institute. She is a soil biogeochemist. Say that 5 times fast. And her specialty is soil carbon sequestration and how it relates to grazing management. And we work together closely on a project that is trying to better understand how soil health is linked with other ecological outcomes and grazing management, and also social and economic resilience of ranching in America. So really, she was the perfect person to have on the podcast to talk all things soil, soil health, soil carbon. And there's going to be 2 parts to this episode. The first is going to be all about the science behind soil health and soil carbon and the science that's driving these carbon markets. And then the second is going to be more specific about the opportunities available to ranchers to join the carbon market. And the reason I chose today's episode topic is that carbon is such a hot topic, not only in society, but in agriculture. And I talk with ranchers all over the West who have heard about carbon markets, but don't necessarily know the science behind them or how to get involved. So hopefully we can answer some of your questions today. So Paige, welcome to the podcast. And
thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about how you got into the space of ranching and soil health.
Well, it's a bit of a convoluted story. I didn't come from an ag background. I grew up in a rural ag-centric state, but from a very blue-collar family. And I started as an undergraduate at a liberal arts school in the middle of nowhere, Georgia. And I wound up in a class that I just needed to fill my major called food ethics. And we wound up in this module covering kind of the environmental and animal welfare implications of livestock agriculture. And it was just kind of a light bulb in that classroom. I was like, this is so interesting. How do I learn more? And so I wound up doing research as an undergrad. I was invited to do some microbiology research in the department where I was majoring, and designed a research project on foodborne pathogens that are derived from different ways of producing livestock. And I think from there, it became apparent to me pretty early on that I was more interested in the environmental side of livestock production. So I wound up at Michigan State University doing a Master's of Animal Science with Dr. Jason Roundtree, who is the lead PI in the project that Nikki and I worked together on, the 3M project. And as a master's student, I was doing work trying to understand what our levers were for reducing the greenhouse gas footprint of various beef production strategy. So what is the greenhouse gas footprint, for example, of grass finishing an animal versus, finishing one in a feedlot? And through that work, it became apparent to me that soil carbon sequestration was one of those things that seemed to be a really big opportunity, but something that not many people had studied or well understood. So we knew that it had the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the beef production supply chain, but we had no idea how much potential that was or what exactly kinds of grazing management led to the type of soil carbon accrual that would be important for that. And so that's what really, I think, catapulted my academic career. From there, I went to UC Berkeley for my PhD, and that's where I really got started in Western range systems. So I was in the environmental science department, but I was co-mentored by a rangeland ecologist and a soil biogeochemist. And so I took both of those kind of areas of expertise and designed my own academic path, trying to understand the how of grazing management to draw down as much soil carbon as we can.
I love that story so much. I mean, you were all over the place. And if you haven't seen Paige's work that you did in Michigan, I think that everyone should read that article. So if you could just briefly summarize that work, because it is super cool.
Yeah, for sure. So this was the very first, well, not the first, the second paper I ever was the lead author on. And this was the paper I published as the result of my master's work. And so I had the really unique opportunity to work on a research farm that had been collecting soil carbon data for some time by the time I got there, which at the time was rare and absolutely unheard of, because the kind of soil carbon space in terms of thinking about soil carbon accrual as a net negative for greenhouse gas emissions was completely new and nascent. And so this was a research farm that was owned and operated by Michigan State University, but that was managed by Jason Roundtree at Michigan State. And they had collected some very early soil carbon data from this research farm before they changed their grazing management practices. So this is like 2011, 2012. And by the time I led the resampling effort as part of my master's, so we went back after 4 or 5 years, the farm had transitioned from kind of continuous grazing and haying, pretty conventional practices, to what we refer to as adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So it's a highly adaptive, kind of short duration, high intensity form of grazing. And after 4 years of that kind of grazing, we collected more soil samples to be able to estimate how much additional soil carbon had been stored in soils due to the grazing management shift. And so what I did with those data is I used the soil carbon sequestration, so the amount of soil carbon that had been gained over those 4 years, and I converted that to what we call carbon dioxide equivalents. So when we add up all of the greenhouse gas emissions in a production supply chain, it's made up of all kinds of greenhouse gas emissions, including methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide. So we've got to find a way to compare apples to apples. So we convert those greenhouse gas emissions to a common metric called a CO2 equivalent. So I converted the amount of soil carbon that had been accrued into a CO2 equivalent. That way we knew what the greenhouse gas footprint was before accounting for the amount of additional soil carbon that was stored. And I used that amount of soil carbon as kind of a subtraction from the total greenhouse gas footprint. And so then it became really clear that because of the difference in grazing management, those soils were accruing enough carbon to actually have a really large impact on the greenhouse gas footprint. And it was just for the finishing phase, so I didn't do a complete life cycle analysis, but I think that's what spurred a lot of the interest in this kind of thing. So trying to understand that grazing management as a form of greenhouse gas mitigation or climate change mitigation. And that's the kind of work I've been doing ever since.
Yeah. And so I think we need to take a step back. You said soil carbon and carbon sequestration.
Yes. Sorry.
Let's take a step back, and can you just start with the basics? What is soil carbon and what is soil carbon sequestration?
For sure. So carbon is one of those molecules that exist in all kinds of different things. And in chemistry, we refer to things as organic when they contain carbon. So it's really any kind of thing that contains carbon is organic. And it's the building block of all kinds of different things. So plants like cellulose and lignin, in our bodies, carbohydrates and the things that we eat. Carbon is found in all of the different muscle fibers and DNA. And so the different kinds of molecules that contain carbon range far and wide. But when carbon containing molecules like plants or microbes or manure make it into soil, we call that soil organic carbon. And there's a lot of different ways it can get there. Soils in general hold a lot of soil carbon. They actually hold more carbon than all the carbon in the atmosphere and all the plants on Earth combined.
Wow.
And we can change how much carbon is in those soils through a process called soil carbon sequestration or soil carbon accrual. And so that means changing how much biomass plants are producing or how much manure is making it into soils. These are kind of major controls on how much soil carbon that's stored and how much we can change.
Mm-hmm. And so when we think about ranchers and cattle producers, why should they care about soil carbon? Why does it matter? And maybe how does it relate to the overall health of their soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. So grazing lands are, well, I love rangelands, so I've got this like kind of emotional attachment to rangelands, but I think even if you're not convinced that rangelands are like this really beautiful space to be working in, the thing that I like to lead with when I'm talking to people about the importance of soil carbon and grazing lands is that grazing lands contain a ton of soil carbon already, just because of how much space grazing lands take up. So, we use some agricultural lands for cropping, some are forested, but actually the vast majority of land on Earth is in some kind of grazing. And so just because of the sheer amount of space they take up, they hold a lot of soil carbon. But because of things like human mismanagement of grazing and development, intensification of agricultural practices, a lot of grazing lands have lost quite a lot of soil carbon, in some cases up to half of what they originally stored. So we call that, in the biogeochemistry space, we call that the soil carbon deficit. So think about like your checking account being in the red. So how much money would it take to put into that account to put it back in the green? That's what we think of as a soil carbon deficit. And so there's a lot of space and opportunity to store additional soil carbon in grazing land soils in particular. And that's important for goals like climate change mitigation as one example, but I think there are other real tangible ways that farmers and ranchers can think about why soil carbon is important to them, particularly in terms of soil health. So soil carbon accumulation, those conversations tend to happen often separately from soil health conversations. But the honest to goodness truth is that soil carbon drives a lot of what we tend to think about as healthy soils. So for example, all else equal, soils that contain more carbon can hang on to more water. They can cycle nutrients more effectively. They're less prone to erosion. They're more productive. And so these are things that matter to ranchers on a day-to-day basis in a way that maybe talking about climate change mitigation or soil carbon accrual doesn't quite resonate with them. Talking to folks in terms of the things that the felt benefits they can gain from soil carbon accrual is the kind of soil health piece of that.
Yeah, so even if you're a producer who does not even like the idea of carbon markets, there's still some incentive to work to accumulate and improve your soil carbon in that sense.
Absolutely. Taking efforts to put more carbon in your soil through grazing management, just as one example, is going to do a lot for how your soils work for you. So paying attention to things like minimizing bare ground if and when that's a possibility, or preventing overgrazing, things like that can do a lot for, like I said, those tangible benefits. So you might notice your lands become more productive, for example, or some of those bare spaces start to fill in, or maybe it takes longer for your plants to dry out in a dry season, things like that.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads me to my next question is, how are cattle a part of this carbon cycle and soil carbon sequestration? Like, I know in the past you've talked about shoots versus roots.
Yeah.
So what are those mechanisms that cattle play a role in, and how can they positively and then also negatively maybe impact that carbon cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing a lot of work on that here at CSU, and actually it's funny because you would think that we would have just like pulled the lid off of all of these mechanisms already, because soil carbon has been such a prominent part of this conversation for so long. But in reality, these kind of mechanistic links between cattle, carbon, and climate change are a little bit nebulous. But we can boil it down to the ways in which we know that cattle and grazing impact plants and how those impacts trickle down to impacts in the soil. So I always like to lead this by saying that everything we do with respect to grazing management only has indirect effects on soil carbon. It's always cattle directly influencing the plants, which then are our main levers for influencing soil carbon. So things like the amount of biomass. So for example, if you were to be chronically overgrazing, you'll notice more bare ground, or maybe your plant community shifts toward more invasive species structure, more annuals versus perennials. Annual plants, they live longer, they don't come back year after year. They also store a lot less of their carbon in their roots versus their shoots or what's above ground. And we know, for example, root carbon and exudates, which are how roots kind of communicate with the soil in terms of nutrient exchange, those tend to be a lot more influential when it comes to soil carbon accrual. And so those are the types of things that can be directly impacted by grazing. It's like how much energy are plants storing in their roots, or how much are they exudating with the soil matrix around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, what does the science say on how ranchers can potentially improve how much soil carbon they have?
It depends a lot, region to region, and in full transparency, I don't think the scientists have done a very great job of capturing kind of the nitty gritty of exact management levers and how and when to implement them and how they're going to impact your soil carbon. And a lot of that is because grazing systems are just tough to research. And also because I think for a long time, researchers have gotten away with not really involving ranchers in their research. So maybe collecting soils data from experimental ranches, but not talking to real life ranchers. And so maybe some of the things they're collecting aren't really relevant, or the grazing management isn't realistic. That's been the case for about 50 years now. But I think with this kind of newer generation of research that Nikki and I are part of now, we have a really great opportunity to start uncovering some of this. And so there is a couple of kind of just general rules of thumb that I could probably distill. One is that it depends on the region you're in. So for example, the type of grazing that's going to be most influential for soil carbon in the southeastern US, where you have year-round grazing, is not going to be the same as maybe the best management practices for places like Colorado and Wyoming. You're just much more limited by precipitation and your grazing season, and a lot of your precipitation is coming down in the form of snow, for example. But there are a couple, I think, general rules that apply everywhere. And most of them are honestly just the soil health principles. So making sure that you have as much soil cover as possible. And for grazing in particular, I think the thing I keep in my back pocket most often is adaptability. So making sure to monitor the way your plants are responding to your grazing in any given grazing event, and then making decisions based on your plant response, rather than, for example, having set in and out dates or a stocking rate that you don't manage every year, or your grazing season being more a thing of tradition versus something that you're taking from your plants as an ecological cue. So sometimes that means, you graze a pasture and animals might have been in there for a week, and you come in and you're like, these plants are looking a little short. Maybe then it's time to move them off. And then maybe that pasture has had a month of rest, and you come back and you take another look and you're like, they're not really growing back the way I want them to, maybe because it's been a dry week or something. Then you might decide to take those animals somewhere else instead of back into the same pasture. That's kind of the adaptive decision-making framework that I think applies everywhere, because it's less about being prescriptive in the way that you manage your animals, because that varies by region and by your own ranch's context, and mostly just about paying attention to the way that your plants and your soils are responding.
Mm-hmm. So you talk a lot about varying by region, and I think that's important to consider when we think about how lucrative a carbon project in a carbon market can be.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we hear that carbon sequestration is driven by climate and how much rain you get. And so what are some of the things that can, let me rephrase this. How can soil carbon sequestration vary by where a rancher is located? And what are those variables that are playing into that?
Yeah, for sure. So there are some kind of master drivers and mediators to whether or not soil carbon accrual is even possible in a region, and beyond that, how much you might stand to accrue or lose in a given year. So, for example, in places like the upper Midwest, for example, so they have a lot of rainfall that falls predominantly in the summer, but their grazing window is short. But because it's cold in the winter, during the growing season, you have a giant primary productivity season. So your plants grow well and they grow fast. And that is an example of when you might expect to accrue a lot of carbon, especially if that, soils have been degraded for any reason. So for example, if you're converting like a row cropping system into a pasture that you will graze, because you've lost a lot of soil carbon and you've got a lot of opportunity to grow big plants because of the climate, that might be a system where you can accrue a lot of carbon in your soils very quickly. Now, if we think about areas in arid or semi-arid places, pretty much everything west of the Mississippi in the United States, these lands are arid or semi-arid, and that's defined by how much precipitation they get and how variable that precipitation is from year to year, and also the pattern with which it drops. So, for example, in California, it's a xeric climate where you have wet and dry, but not a lot of flexibility in your temperatures, whereas in Wyoming and Colorado, you have a lot of you have true seasons, and your precipitation falls in two different forms: snow and rain, and I guess hail here.
Yeah.
So when you're limited by precipitation, that's going to limit how much plant biomass you're able to produce, and also when. And so if you're going through an extended season of dryness, for example, that's a master kind of barrier on how much plant biomass you're able to grow. And so your opportunities to accrue carbon, even with grazing management, are more limited. But I will say there is potential to accrue soil carbon in any climate. Some are just more limited than others. And there will always be kind of nuanced scenarios. For example, in a drought, even the best grazing management practices might not have capacity to store additional carbon because there's not enough rain to produce enough plants to do that. But it does still have other positive benefits to be using kind of adaptive grazing systems, because they might mean you hold on to more of your carbon that you have instead of losing a lot of it. But so I kind of think of grazing management and rangeland soil carbon accumulation as a tiered system. So, the master drivers being temperature and precipitation, just as an example, and then grazing management kind of operating within the brackets that those two master drivers present.
Yeah. Okay. So with all of that soil health background, thank you, by the way, for all that information, I think we should move into part 2 of this podcast episode, all about carbon market opportunities. And this is what I love to talk about. And I like that you're here to talk about it, because I think we have a little bit of a different perspective on the market. I wanted us both to start by discussing our perspectives on the carbon market, because, like I said, I think we have a little bit of a different perspective. So how I got into this space is very much my boss, Dr. Derek Skast at the University of Wyoming, really saw that there was a need for more research into carbon markets. And so we started talking. We started just diving right into carbon markets, looking at the methodologies, looking at different carbon programs, and really diving into opportunities for ranchers specifically. And so that led us to starting to talk to producers, getting involved with, state legislators and talking about carbon markets. And next thing you know, we are both getting calls every other week from producers who want to talk about it, because there is not a lot of people in the carbon market space who aren't trying to sell you something or just have the information to provide unbiased sources about the market. And so that's kind of what my role has been. And I've started doing consulting for producers, just free consulting, talking about carbon markets, the opportunities for them, and these different carbon companies. And really my perspective is, if it's an opportunity to put money in ranchers' pockets, it's a good thing. But some of the conversations we've had in the past, you have maybe a different opinion on the science behind the market. So just tell me a little bit about your thoughts on carbon markets in general.
Yes. So maybe just like a quick background on how carbon markets are meant to operate would be good. And then we can get into the specifics of, I think, where maybe we diverge a little bit. So the premise of a carbon market is basically, as we as a collective try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, companies for whom their supply chains are difficult to reduce emissions have the opportunity in any carbon market, whether it's compliance-based or voluntary, to buy offsets from other folks in sectors for whom it's easier to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. So in agriculture, because we are working in natural systems and have the opportunity to accrue soil carbon, which is what we call a natural climate solution, that net negative can then be capitalized on by companies who are looking to purchase offsets to offset their own emissions that they don't want to reduce internally. So that's the way the offset carbon market is meant to operate. And this started as a voluntary market, at least as far as I understand it, back in the early 2000s. It was called the Chicago Climate Exchange. And that was the first kind of voluntary carbon market that came online in the United States. And it was entirely voluntary. I will also mention other nations do have compliance-based market that are run by the government and, et cetera. Like, for example, the EU and Australia are two examples of those. In the United States, carbon markets have always been entirely voluntary, except in the state of California, who has a statewide run cap and trade system.
Yeah.
But soil carbon has always been voluntary. And so early on, when I think soil carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas mitigation, the science of that first started really ramping up, it started in cropping systems. And so soil carbon credits were developed for those systems, and late in the Chicago Climate Exchange, rangelands did come online as producing soil carbon credits. That system collapsed in 2011 because the price of credits plummeted. And in rangelands in particular, the reason why some of that was really difficult is because measuring soil carbon can be very difficult, particularly on rangelands. So that collapsed in 2011. And then in the past, I would say 5 or so years is when we've seen kind of a resurgence of interest in the soil carbon market. And this time, rangelands and grazing have played a significantly larger role in that space than I think they ever have before. And so to the extent that ranchers can partner with companies, agencies, registries to sell soil carbon offsets that they're generating. So for a ranch, for example, that is using or is transitioning their grazing management to any kind of grazing management system that does accumulate soil carbon, that additional soil carbon is what we call a soil carbon offset, just on a mass basis. So like, we might say $30 per ton of CO2 or something like that. That's based on how much soil carbon they're accruing. Farmers and ranchers can then have somebody come out and measure that delta over time, and they can sell those carbon offsets to companies that want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So some very famous recent examples have been things like Shopify a few years ago purchased several million dollars worth of soil carbon credits. But in order for that system to work the way it's intended to work, a whole bunch of criteria need to be met. But at its most basic level, one is that you need to be absolutely certain that you've accumulated as much soil carbon as you're selling. Otherwise, what tends to happen is you generate credits for soil carbon that we didn't accumulate. And so that's one risk. And I think farmers and ranchers are really attracted to this because it's another opportunity for an income stream. And considering that ranching is already a really slim profit margin enterprise, I think it's really, exciting for ranchers to think about finally being in the green or to have some kind of buffer in terms of their profit and income. 2 criteria need to be met for soil carbon offsets to work the way we want them to work. One is we need to be sure that the amount of carbon that we're generating offsets has actually been accumulated in the soil. Because if we're allowing companies to not reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions and instead purchase these offsets, the offsets need to be actual carbon removed from the atmosphere. And on the flip side, ranchers stand to make a decent amount of money from this, which is great and exciting because their enterprises are often slim on the profit margins. But I think the issue that I tend to have in the current way that carbon markets are operating, particularly on rangelands, is in the measurement piece. Because I want ranchers to have this other income stream. I want them to be able to persist and sustain themselves and all the things that makes ranching livelihoods what they are. But because rangeland soil carbon is hard to measure, actually quite a lot of the soil carbon offsets that are being generated from rangeland systems because of grazing management improvements or seeding of legumes or what have you, we're not actually sure that that amounts to any additional soil carbon. And so that gets into a lot of the, in the weeds nitty gritty about how we measure it. But because rangeland soil carbon is kind of a new paradigm in soil science in general, we can't just copy and paste the protocols that were developed for measuring soil carbon change on croplands and apply them to rangelands. And that's because rangelands are a lot more variable. They take up a lot more space. And so capturing that change over time requires a lot more samples. And yet companies are generating soil carbon offsets on the basis of too many samples and data that are a lot more variable and messy than we would otherwise like to be able to tell a true difference amongst all the noise. And so that's my, I think, qualm that I see in the current carbon market space, is because I think we've started to really identify the measurement challenges, but the incentive for any company to be doing it right isn't there. The measurement companies need to make money. The registry companies need to make money. The companies that are processing the soil samples need to make money. And so everybody's got to get their cut of the pie. And by the time the money comes back to the ranchers, that's exciting. But in order to take enough soil samples to be able to really tell that change, it would become prohibitively expensive. And so instead of doing that, we're just taking too few samples to be able to tell that difference. And so I suspect that that very first criteria that we need for a soil carbon market to be effective, which is being 100% certain that that soil carbon is being accumulated, we're not quite meeting that criteria.
Yeah.
And so it's good for ranchers to make money, but in terms of the climate change space, we don't know how well we're doing actually.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is within carbon markets, like ranching opportunities are relatively new. And if we take a step back, thinking about carbon markets in general, I think there's 170 or something crazy different carbon credits that you can generate. Like the most popular one is probably from forests, and there's some renewable energy ones. The ranching space is relatively new.
Yeah.
And I think what might be helpful is if we talk a little bit about how the market works. And so you kind of talked about it a little bit, but there's the rancher, and he works with a carbon company, and they're also called project developers. And some common carbon companies, Goro, I always say Qatari wrong, but Qatari, Native, Grassroots. These are common companies we're seeing in the rotational grazing, ranching, carbon market space. And they hold a really important role, and jump in if I'm missing anything, but they typically own the rights to the credits, and thereby they assume a lot of the risk associated with the credits. Like if they don't generate credits, if the price tanks of credits. And what I always say to people that I consult with is that as a rancher, you should not be investing your own money to get into a carbon project.
Absolutely. No, I would not advise any rancher to invest a single dollar of their own, because then you're up for some amount of financial risk there. And that is a good purpose that I think project developers have started to become apprised to, is also taking responsibility for some of that liability that comes with the potential for no carbon accrual. And so the project developers, for example, might front a lot of money to pay for the soil sampling. Well, maybe that grazing management doesn't accumulate any carbon after 5 years. And that liability then typically in most contracts I've seen falls on the developer, right?
Yeah. And so they do hold an important role, because they'll pay for the project to enter the market, which can cost thousands of dollars just to get registered in the market. They'll pay for getting the project verified and certified, taking soil samples. If there needs to be some kind of improvement on the ranch, they should pay for that. And these companies, they're willing to pay ranchers to get involved. And I think, a lot of times they receive a lot of criticism, but at the same time, they are assuming a lot of that risk. But so those project developers, the carbon companies, also work directly with the registries. Can you describe who the registries are and what the rules they do or what they make?
Sure. So registries are kind of like a certifying body. So these are kind of the overarching organizations that set the standards for what a project needs to meet in order to generate certifiable offsets. So one example is the Climate Action Reserve, CAR, or VERA is another one. And so they will develop protocols that lay out all the criteria that any given project needs to meet all the thresholds and bells and whistles to be able to have what they call like a stamped and sealed carbon credit. And so, for example, Vera and CAR both have protocols written specifically for the different methodologies that are acceptable in terms of soil sampling and procedures for handling soil samples from grazing lands.
Yeah.
And that's probably where most of my qualms come into play, because I think project developers are operating in a system that is often set up by the registry. So, for example, they can't use methods that aren't certified by a registry or something like that. And so it's really the registry that sets the minimum threshold of criteria for what it takes to have what they call, certifiable credits.
Yeah. And so basically within these registries, there's two main ways that a rancher could join the market. They, one, could have the carbon company and the verifier come out, take soil samples, and establish a baseline, and then make some kind of management change. Typically, that's some kind of rotational grazing, although there is a company that will pay you to apply nitrogen fertilizer and reseed, some kind of perennial. And so you do that management change, which has to be additional to what you're already doing, which is where the term additionality comes from. And then they'll come back in 5 years and take soil samples again with the idea that with that change in management, you've accumulated some soil carbon that would result in carbon credits.
Right. And also permanence. So additionality and permanence are the two kind of trigger words for soil carbon markets. Like Nikki said, additionality is like you need to prove that you're sequestering additional carbon that wouldn't have already been entering the soil on its own volition. So that often is just like a practice change, for example. Permanence, I think, is a little bit of a trickier one because, and the idea is that for any payment for a carbon offset, you want to ensure that that carbon is not going to re-enter the atmosphere. You want to make sure it's a permanent withdrawal from the atmosphere. Soil carbon, none of it's permanent, actually. There are forms that are more persistent versus more cyclical. But usually in terms of contracts that I've seen, it just means farmers and ranchers need to sign off that they don't plan on like reverting their practices within some duration, often like 100 years. So you can't sign on for a contract and then at the end of your contract, 10 years, you till up all your soils and lose that soil carbon. I think that's how permanence is operationalized, right? I understand.
Yeah, and so the second main way, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is something called avoided conversion.
Yeah.
And so this involves putting your land in some kind of easement and legally showing that you're not going to engage in an activity that results in soil carbon loss, like tilling or, building houses. And so you don't actually have to take soil samples with avoided conversion projects. So how do we even know that those projects are doing their job?
So it's a bit of a different take. I actually kind of like it better. I think when I first started to hear about avoided conversion credits, my knee jerk was to be like, well, they're not accumulating more carbon. That's not additional. It doesn't meet any of the other criteria. But as I've had time to reflect more on it, I think what I've started to come to terms with is that the easiest way to at least maintain the current soil carbon that we have in our grazing lands is to avoid conversion. And so, adding additional carbon is the space that I operate in. That these are the conversations that drive the project that Nikki and I work on together and my conversations with ranchers. But the easiest thing we can do is just not till them, not develop them, not turn them into anything else that's not a grazing land. And above and beyond that, we can do all these management things to help accumulate small additional pockets of carbon. But the avoided conversion is kind of contractually obligating producers not to sell lands that might put them at risk for losing soil carbon and contributing more to climate change. So it's not a contract, at least as far as I understand it, meant to draw more carbon into soils, but it's meant to prevent adding more carbon to the atmosphere from those soils. And it also provides the other, I think, co-benefit of maintaining grazing lands as grazing lands, which, as we know, comes with a whole host of other co-benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a really kind of easy way to do something really good. It's just not the same as practices to accumulate.
Yeah, and the problem with avoided conversions as well is you kind of have to be a producer who's already thinking about putting your land in an easement.
Yes.
Because these contracts are 40 and 100 years long.
Yeah.
But the other thing too with avoided conversions is projects is you need to be in an area where there's high potential for crop production or development.
Right. Yeah.
So if we're in the boondocks of Wyoming, you
Yeah.
know, there's not going to be a ton of potential to join these avoided conversion projects.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I saw a lot of the benefits of this kind of thing actually in California. So obviously population growth, people moving into California, urban sprawl, these are all issues that have caused a whole host of problems related to agriculture in California, including soaring land prices. And there's this old adage in rangeland socioeconomics in which ranchers, at least large kind of traditional ranchers, tend to be land rich, cash poor.
Mm-hmm.
And so in California, the way that these easements were working, they were really picking up steam by the time I left a few years ago, is that NGOs and conservation organizations were approaching ranchers to help put their lands in an easement. And that did two things at once. It offered ranchers some cash in their pocket to be able to continue ranching and prevented those lands from being at risk of development.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one example of where it could be really cool.
Right.
But yeah, to your point, that's not going to have a ton of leverage everywhere.
Yeah. And so just going back to those two options.
Yeah.
So when we go back to the option one of changing your management, these carbon companies will pay ranchers to develop internal fencing, water,
Mm-hmm.
even use virtual fencing. And so they will pay to help the rancher make these improvements,
Mm-hmm.
which even if the project might not generate, or be very lucrative, there's still a benefit of it making improvements on the ranch.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so when we step back, thinking about how the market works, we have the rancher, we've talked about them working with the carbon companies kind of mediating and working with the registries to make sure that the carbon project is meeting the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the third party verifiers, people soil sampling. Who are those people?
Yes. So the verifiers I have not had to interact with a lot. So I'd be out kicking my coverage to dive into that. But the folks who are on the ground taking the physical soil samples are often not the project developers. And so what they do, these project development companies usually come online to serve the purpose that Nikki was saying. They mediate between the ranchers generating the credits, the certification bodies who are setting the rules, but often they're not set up to be the folks on the ground. So there are these other companies that are often contracted out to go take these soil samples. So these would be like Earth Optics, for example. And these are companies that they offer a variety of services, but some of them offer end-to-end. So they'll design your sampling scheme, how many samples, where to take those samples, how to take the samples. And then they'll go out and physically take them by whatever method that they decided, either a Giddings unit or an auger or what have you. But that's the kind of little niche that those companies serve. And as far as the grazing and rangeland space, there are actually very few of them. I think I can name 2 or 3 max.
Yeah.
So they're very limited.
Yeah. And they have arguably one of the biggest roles because
For sure.
they determine how many carbon credits can really be issued to a project. And so that's the next step is once the carbon company hears back from that verifier and how many carbon credits were accumulated on the property or how many can be issued based on the avoided loss of carbon, that revenue then gets to the carbon companies because they own the carbon credits.
Mm-hmm.
And they pay the ranchers based on a predetermined amount in contracts.
Yes.
And that completes the cycle of this market.
Yes, with the exception of it might be helpful to cover like interim credits
Mhm.
versus end-to-end or end-capped
Yeah.
credits. So soil carbon accumulation, especially from grazing management, can take a long time.
Mhm.
And typically, these contracts are signed for 5 years. And so, what that means is, they'll come collect samples in year one or year zero, and then they'll wait 5 years and they'll come back and collect
Mhm.
more samples. And that's about as much time as we think it takes to be able to see any difference from grazing management, because soil carbon sequestration in especially semi-arid places can be low and slow. So, you need to wait a while to be able to see that cumulative difference. Um, in a black and white universe, what that would mean is that any rancher who signs a contract would need to wait 5 years to be able to receive any kind of payment for the carbon offsets they're generating. So what some companies have decided to do in the interim to be able to offer some amount of like initial financial payout is develop or issue what we call interim credits. So they'll offer you a payment, a smaller payment, based on what they expect you to accumulate in terms of your soil carbon year after year after year. And so that means a rancher who signs a contract with a carbon company that does offer interim credits would be receiving payments in all 5 years, but smaller ones because it's based on projections. And then once those companies come out and resample after five years, they go through a true up process. So that's when they really get to compare how much carbon you've actually accumulated versus how much they expected you to accumulate, which is how they generated your interim credits.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note this process of, changing your management, doing rotational grazing, and then getting paid. There have been so few projects that have actually completed this cycle.
Yes.
Which is the problem for us as researchers, because we want to know how lucrative these markets can be in this rotational space. There's only been one project doing this rotational management change that has actually been issued credits. There's projects going, but there's only been one in central Montana with Vera who has actually been issued credits. And it's because the market is so new. These projects are just getting going and they haven't hit that year 5 yet. And that's the problem. There's some avoided conversion payments going out, but again, that's a totally different methodology.
Yeah. Takes time, it takes people, it takes money, all the things that we have too few of.
Yeah. And when we think about how financially lucrative a project can be, I think it's kind of goes back to our initial conversation of how many tons of carbon per acre can we actually accumulate. And again, it varies by location, but I have not seen in a contract with rotational grazing more than $25 a credit.
Oh, you mean the price per ton?
The price per ton.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we think about carbon credits, one carbon credit is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents. And so if we're not even sequestering a full ton of carbon per acre, how much are we really going to be seeing per acre?
Yeah, and I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, because in all reality, in order for this space to be sustainable in the long run, the price of carbon offsets per ton need to be high enough that everyone gets paid, including the rancher, and it also encompasses all of the costs embedded in having the market run. I've seen cost estimates for what that kind of breakthrough price should be. They're all over $40 a ton. And like Nikki mentioned, right now we're operating on a much, much, much smaller price. And so I think, I don't really know what the projections are in terms of price increases, but I think as far as I understand, it would be much more effective and would offer us a lot more opportunities to grow the market at a higher price per ton.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem with these projects being so new. We just haven't seen how many credits are being accumulated.
Totally. And that does depend. It depends on a lot of things. One is regionality. So back to the things we were talking about earlier, including your precipitation, your climate. But there's a couple of other factors that are really influential in kind of bracketing how much soil carbon any rancher might accumulate. One is land use history. So for example, if you're operating on a parcel of land that's been just beat year after year. Maybe it's been tilled for a long time, or it was heavily overgrazed prior to being purchased by a new owner operator. Then that soil carbon deficit is larger, and so the amount you stand to accumulate in the near term is larger and faster.
Mhm.
And so then, you might expect something more than a half a ton of carbon per hectare per year. And one example, so the work I did in my master's in California, that research farm had been, tilled and hayed and conventionally grazed. And in the first 4 years, we were measuring soil carbon sequestration when the grazing management first changed to AMP grazing. We measured an estimated 3.5 tons of carbon being sequestered per hectare per year. And we're about to come out with a 10-year update paper. And so the rate has diminished over time, but it's still well above 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. But again, because it's wet there, they produce a lot of plants, that's probably at the higher end of the expected range. And out in places like, Colorado and Wyoming, like I said, we still have a lot more science to do. So I actually don't have a very good estimate, but I've never seen anything convincing, at least, over half a ton of carbon per hectare per year. So it's lower, but also you might be accumulating that soil carbon over a much larger ranch, for example. We work with producers that own and operate tens of thousands of acres compared to the smaller operating sizes in other places in the country. So it's a bit of a push and pull in every place.
Yeah, and one of the biggest comments I get from producers is, "I've already been doing good management, so
Right.
how can I get involved?" And can you just talk a little bit about, we can't just keep accumulating carbon forever. Eventually, it's going to plateau. So what about those people who have already had good management going?
Yeah, so this is, I think, where I struggle with the additionality part of the carbon market, especially when it comes to grazing management. And I think the premise behind, needing to adopt something additional so that the carbon you're accumulating is additional, that is a structure that does nothing to reward producers who have been doing good management for a long time. And some of these folks are absolute pioneers where they are. And so maybe they're responsible for dozens of other ranchers shifting their grazing management towards something better. And only those new folks can take advantage of those carbon market opportunities. And so then what do we do to reward folks who have been doing the right thing for a really long time? And unfortunately, the carbon market is just it's not available to them. And the other thing with additionality is, as you accumulate carbon, over time, the rate of accumulation does tend to plateau. But there's a huge debate right now in the soil carbon space, which is what we call a saturation limit. So if you were to think of soil carbon as having some ceiling, like above which you can't put any more carbon in the ground. That was how soil biogeochemistry and the science operated for a really long time. We've come to learn more about just how dynamic soil carbon is, though. So it's absolutely true that the more carbon you hold in your soil, the slower the rate will be over time. But I don't think that we are as certain as we once were that there is this absolute ceiling. And there will always be some dynamism in your soil carbon, for example, with a drought or plants and microbes that change carbon stocks at any given time. So I think it might get harder and harder over time to accumulate carbon, but because of the dynamic nature of soil carbon, there's always potential to accumulate more. But it might be, maybe you've been doing the best grazing management ever for 50 years, and in order to accumulate more, maybe you need to seed legumes or something. So the management interventions need to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But usually that's happening at time scales that surpass the type of time scales that we are alive on, or that certainly a carbon project is developed on.
Yeah. Well, I think you and I could both talk about carbon and carbon markets for much, much longer, but and to avoid boring people, we will wrap it up there, and I'll put Paige's website in the description. So if you want to learn more about the research that she's done, you can look there. And a little plug, I do have a paper coming out that's been accepted for publication in Rangelands titled Opportunities for Ranchers in the Carbon Market. And so you can read more about the risks and uncertainties because I really drive those home in that paper, and it's open access, so you can check that out. All right, Paige, before I let you go, I have one question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm posing with a tough topic because I think you can handle it.
Okay.
And that is methane.
Yes, I love this.
There's so much talk
Yeah.
around ways that ranchers can reduce methane.
Yeah.
And we know methane is a form of carbon. But from some of the work that I'm starting to do, when I look at research, a lot of people are measuring methane from cattle. And they're not accounting, though. So rarely do they account for how much carbon the land is taking up.
Yes.
From which those cattle graze. And to me, it's a bit misleading because we're telling the story like cattle are releasing this much methane, but they're not accounting for the ground and how much carbon the ground is taking up. And so what is your thoughts surrounding methane reduction, these conversations around it, and really accounting for the land side of it?
Yes, this is a really good question. And this, I think, if we were to think back to the story I was telling about how I got initially involved in this during my master's work. So typically, the way that we add up all of the greenhouse gas emissions in a supply chain is through a method called life cycle assessment. And essentially, it's just trying to account for all of the processes involved in making a product that contribute greenhouse gas emissions. So in the beef supply chain, there's you can think of transportation, the growing of feed crops for when cattle are finished in a feedlot, energy consumption, all these things. But what turns out in most cases to be the most significant portion of the pie, so if you were to think of greenhouse gas emissions in like a pie chart, and some of it's transportation, some of it's feed production, some of it's what have you, enteric methane is almost always the largest chunk of the pie. And so that is methane from enteric fermentation. So, cattle having evolved to be able to digest things that we can't use for human consumption. That's because methane is what animal scientists and ruminant nutritionists think of as a form of energetic loss. And so the more you feed a ruminant animal high energy things like soybeans and corn, grain, for example, the less methane they'll emit per day versus the more roughage or things that are very lignified like grass an animal or ruminant consumes, the more methane they will emit per day. So methane is really the function of two things. One is diet, what they're eating, and the other is time. So for an animal that's entirely grass-fed and finished from birth to slaughter, they often have the largest methane footprint because it takes them longer to reach market weight, and they're eating more roughage, which just produces more methane through enteric fermentation. Whereas compared to an animal finished in a feedlot, or really the feedlot in general, it would be like the equivalent I'll make is like trying to gain weight on an entirely pizza diet versus an entirely salad bar diet. That's the easiest way to think about methane. On salad bar, it's going to take you a lot more time to gain weight, and you're probably going to be rootin' tootin' a lot more. That's the same as cattle, pretty much. And so there's no way to get around the fact that methane is just a natural part of having ruminants. It's also kind of a beautiful part of it, considering that these animals have evolved to eat this thing on landscapes that we wouldn't be able to use for anything else, if not grazing them for food. But it's one of those things that's become tricky to talk about in terms of the climate landscape, because methane is what we call a short-lived climate pollutant. And so the amount of warming it causes is really impactful compared to, for example, carbon dioxide. But it lasts in the atmosphere for a much shorter amount of time. So the half-life of methane in the atmosphere is about 10 to 15 years, and carbon dioxide is about 100. And so I think it's certainly worthwhile to talk about strategies to reduce methane because we know how impactful it is. At the same time, it's just a natural part of having ruminants, period. And so the only way to entirely get rid of methane would be to have no cattle And that's neither realistic nor, I think, going to help us reach the goals that we want. And so, we can think about ways to graze animals, for example, to reduce the methane part of their greenhouse gas footprint. And I certainly think that that's worthwhile, but it's a bit of a balance then between taking animals out of their kind of ecological niche, which is grazing on grasses, which is the thing that produces the most methane, and capitalizing on those benefits of those systems while thinking about greenhouse gas emissions holistically, which is where the soil carbon piece comes in. And most studies that incorporate a life cycle assessment aren't incorporating soil carbon sequestration because very few people have actually measured it. And that's part of what the 3M project was meant to do. So I'm hopeful that as we acquire more data, we measure soil carbon outcomes on more and more ranches, different grazing management practices, that we will have a lot more leverage and opportunity to figure out what the soil carbon sequestration potential is and how that compares and stacks up to the methane part of the greenhouse gas footprint.
Well, thank you, Paige, for answering that question. And I hope that everyone enjoyed this episode talking about soil carbon and carbon markets. Again, we'll have some resources in the description if you want to learn, read, or hear more. But thank you, Dr. Paige Stanley, for coming on the episode.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki, and thank you all for having me, and happy to answer any questions. If any of y'all have any, just send me an email.